This week we will discuss the problem of evil. This is a problem that a number of you have already raised in the context of our discussions. Put simply, the problem is this. Classical theism understands God as omniscient, omnipotent, and benevolent, and the existence of evil is seen as contradicting this. The problem of evil can be stated in two ways. What is generally called the logical problem of evil runs something like this. An omnipotent, omniscient, and benevolent God would not allow evil in the world. But there is evil, therefore there is no God. The argument hinges on the idea that a benevolent God would want to prevent evil, that an omniscient God would know how to prevent evil, and that an omnipotent God would be able to prevent evil. And that given the fact that there is evil, at least one of these characteristics must not obtain. The evidential problem of evil works inductively. It argues that the evidence for meaningfulness and purpose in the universe notwithstanding, the overwhelming quantity of ultimately gratuitous and unnecessary evil is so overwhelming as to make the existence of an omniscient, omnipotent, and benevolent God extremely unlikely. There have been a number of attempts to answer both of these versions of the argument. One common answer is that God allows evil in order to serve some higher purpose. There are many thinkers who argue that this undercuts the claim of omnipotence, because if God was actually omnipotent, he would be able to serve the higher purpose without allowing evil. Others point out that there may in fact be a logical incompatibility between that higher purpose and the elimination of what we understand as evil, and that therefore this argument in fact is an adequate answer. One variant of the greater good hypothesis is that while omnipotent, God grants to human beings the freedom to make our own decisions, with the inevitable result that some make bad decisions and that evil is the necessary result. The problem with this approach is that it does not account for evils that are not the result of human action, such as natural disasters or such as diseases like cancer. It is, of course, possible to call into question classical theism itself, specifically the requirement that God be understood as absolutely omnipotent. The idea of open theism is a relatively conservative and cautious attempt at this, arguing that the biblical image of God is not of an absolutely sovereign, unconditionally omnipotent being, but rather of a very powerful being who acts in history, but under certain constraints. Process theology goes further, suggesting that God is in fact in time and subject to temporal processes, that in fact God should be understood as an emergent reality or property of the universe, rather than as its omnipotent, omniscient, and benevolent creator. Process theology in this way largely eliminates the problem of evil. My own view is that the problem of evil, as it has traditionally been stated, reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of God. The cosmological, teleological, and ontological arguments demonstrate the existence of necessary being. They show that there has to be a being which is the power of being as such. This is the God of philosophically informed Judaism, Catholicism, and Islam, or at least it was up until the middle of the 12th century, when a number of theologians began to emphasize the doctrine of the sovereignty of God and began to think of the relationship between God's being and our being in a very different way. Now, such a God can be thought of as omnipotent in the sense that it is the cause of everything that exists. It can be thought of as omniscient in the sense that it is fully and completely what everything else merely approximates. And it can be thought of as good in the sense that it is that which every other thing in the universe seeks to the extent of its capacity. But we should not think of it as a being, nor should we think of it as willing this, that, or the other thing for particular individual beings within a universe that it is created as an act of will. God is, and the universe exists necessarily as an expression of the divine nature. Once we understand this, we understand that evil, at least in a certain sense, is inevitable. This is because what everything in the universe wants is to be the power of being as such, to be God. But there can be only one God, because if there were another, it would be identical to the first and not really different. Our condition as finite and contingent beings exposes us inevitably to suffering and makes evil, at least in a certain sense, inevitable and inescapable. Even the salvation that naive followers of so many religions believe they have been promised amounts to little more than being kept as pets. Hardly a situation that fully recognizes the dignity of humanity and our drive to participate in the creative power behind the universe. Does this mean that we're doomed to misery? Absolutely not. It does mean that we're doomed to misery as long as we retain a finite, contingent point of view. Only by achieving what amounts to a divine perspective can we fully appreciate the beauty and goodness of the universe, and it is helping us to achieve that perspective, or something like it, is the aim of higher spiritual disciplines, which we will examine in the final weeks of this course. Where do you stand on this question? How do you respond to the problem of evil, and what difference does it make in the way you live your life?